So that's one of the main allegations from this Amazon documentary, from people who are ex-members of this Institute of Basic Life Principles, is that abuse was very inherent to this whole world. Was that,
Yes.
I'm maybe your personal experience, but also your observation, is that accurate? Or one of my problems, I will caveat this by saying, one of my problems with the documentary is it was obviously created by liberals who want to portray
Yes.
all homeschoolers, all Christians, all conservatives, all people with big families as being part of some weirdo abusive cult. And I reject that.
Yes.
I know that that's not true. So I guess what I'm asking is their portrayal accurate from what you observed and experienced, or did they exaggerate that?
Yeah, well, I will agree with you that that documentary was created by certain people that have a certain agenda, and I think it's important to keep that in mind when you're watching it. As far as what the environment was really like, I think it's a mixed bag, because it really depended on the people who were in the program. What the program did was, one of the biggest emphases of Gothard's teachings was authority. And you have this famous umbrella illustration that he would always bring out, where it's this hierarchy, and you have God up here, he's the upper umbrella. Then underneath it, you have the husband. And then underneath you have the wife, and underneath you have the children. And, he always taught about this hierarchy of authority, which, has biblical parts of it. There are some biblical things of that, but it was very twisted in the sense that he would always teach that if you ever get out from under your umbrella, like if you're a wife and you get out from under your husband's umbrella, or you're a child and you get off from under your parents' umbrella, then you are suddenly going to be vulnerable to Satan's attacks, and you're going to be in grave danger. Your soul and your life are going to be in grave danger. And so it was this very fear-based thing. And what it did was, I think, when you have a teaching or a church or a movement that very much emphasizes or props up male authority, that's not necessarily a bad thing, but I think that it can attract bad men who will then use that as a cover for their abuse. So I think that in that world, there were abusive men that used that as a cover for what they were doing. At the same time, I knew many families who had loving, caring fathers, and never experienced that at all. So one of our pastors was on staff with Bill Gothard, and I think even some of his kids were on staff with Bill Gothard at some point, who is a wonderful guy, a loving guy, never saw any indication that there was any abuse or hurt or brokenness or anything. And so I think it very much depended on the person and or the family that was in that world. But I think it attracted bad people, because it was a kind of an infrastructure that gave cover to those bad people.
What about the sex abuse aspect of it? So obviously the Duggars became the poster child for the Bill Gothard curricula, or Bill Gothard belief system, and their oldest son, Josh Duggar, was convicted of possession of child pornography and sentenced to, I think, 2 decades in federal prison. And one of the things that this documentary portrayed, which is something I had read before the documentary even spoke about it, was that the structure of how Bill Gothard taught his followers to handle abuse, especially sex abuse, was actually to blame women. If a woman was not fulfilling her husband, then if he was unfaithful or abused someone, it was her responsibility. Is that exaggerated? Is that official teaching? And what was your observation of that?
No, it was. There was very much a part of the teaching that was. It was. I think part of the teaching and part of the culture was that in an abuse situation, if you are abused, the first thing that you're taught to do is to ask yourself, like, where am I at fault in this situation? Like, what did I do to bring this on? Or how did I contribute in one way or another? And then the other weird thing that was taught was that, and I don't know where he got this in the scripture. I'm sure he pulled some verses out of context or whatever, but what was taught was that if you're abused, you need to keep in mind that people who are abused receive extra spiritual power from God. I don't really know how else to say it. Is what it was taught was that if you're abused, God will give you some kind of extra spiritual power, and you'll experience some kind of super growth from your abuse situation. And so it almost created um, this perverse world where abuse was almost fetishized or lifted up in a weird way. As far as my personal observations of it, I didn't personally experience that myself or see it with my parents or other parents, but except for the whole discipline thing. But the I think it really it was a lot harder on the women and the girls than it was the boys. A lot of pressure is put on women to look a certain way, to act a certain way, to like they're responsible for the souls of the men in their life if they're being looked at with lust, or they're being sexually harassed or whatever. The women were taught to look at how they were contributing to that. What am I doing? How am I dressing? How am I carrying myself? But the other thing too, I think that created this, and I don't know how this played into Josh Duggar or that family, but Bill Gothard's teaching is very, you don't learn about sex. Like it is something that's not talked about in any way, shape, or form. And you have people getting married who don't even know how sex works. And it's like, and so
Really?
you imagine going through puberty and like through your teen years, kind of like in no man's land, not knowing like what's happening to you and what all this means. And like, it was not talked about, it was not taught in any way. And so I suspect that probably, some of the things that happen are just kids their sexuality is coming out, and they don't understand what it is, and they don't have a healthy way to express it or talk about it. And so weird stuff happens. I don't, it's, yeah. It's just what it was. The culture was such that, the number one goal for your kids is to keep them pure until marriage. And so, you're like, everything that you're doing is directed towards that goal. And so it just wasn't talked about. You don't talk about sex in that world. And it was just, it created this really weird dynamic where there was sexual abuse going on, and you couldn't talk about it, and you didn't have a healthy way to address it or even understand it.
It's almost hard to imagine going through teen years not knowing how to properly order those feelings that universally every human being feels.